how many points you had to get, and we edited that so that we were getting some obscene amount of new guys every time. And at that point, yeah, something ridiculous like that. And we kept playing and dying and playing and dying, and then that's when we finally got to that point where or obviously it's not there, and we're gonna have to do something.
You forgot to make a left at Philly.
Scott, when did you play Major Havoc?
So I was out of San Diego State, down in San Diego, and Major Havoc came in. It was a dedicated Major Havoc, so it was real hardware, and with the roller and playing at the faster speed. Although I didn't really notice that until much later. And I just loved the graphics. Were the vector. I love Tempest, and Quantum had come in. I think maybe shortly after, around that time, and it just wasn't that interesting to me. But Major Havoc was just so. I don't know, just so interesting, it just kept drawing you in and wanted to play. And so at the time, the Daily Aztec would have coupons, and you could get like 12 tokens for $1. But you could only use one per day, so we would go out at night and just grab stacks of newspapers with these coupons and cut them out. And then you'd walk by, before class, in the middle of the day, and after, and you would trade in your $1 to get 12 tokens. And so I'd have 50 tokens, for a day, and we would just play Major Havoc nonstop. And the graphics were just. That movement, I always talked about it before, the camera movement, the way it follows Rex around the maze, it just kind of makes you feel like you're in it. You really kind of felt like you were in this maze running around trying to hit the reactor. And it was just such a compelling game. And then, I left college and didn't see the game for a while, and then about 7 years later, I found somebody converted to a Robocop. And so I tracked down the pieces and put it back together and patched all the holes and all that. And that's actually John Copley's machine. I sold to him a few years ago. But then when I did the FPGAs, I did a Tempest first, and I wanted to do Major Havoc, and I just couldn't get it running. There's some relationships between the two, and it was just really hard to get it working. And I put it on the shelf, but then I talked to these guys, and they gave me some pointers, and I was able to get it working. And so it's still one of my favorite games.
All right, well, so there's us justifying our madness, I suppose. That was the goal of that. So now, Owen, given all that, we know that the home world isn't there, et cetera, but I was always curious about, what was the, I've heard from you that Havoc took 18 months, you were developing it, et cetera. Normal game development was a 6 month.
It was long. It was very long.
What was that, how did it get to be like that, and why did it get cut off and pushed out so abruptly, really?
And how did you get away with 18 months?
Mike, how did I get away with 18 months? I don't even know it. It's a long game, because 6 months, right? Typically a game, 6, maybe 7.
I was deliberately not paying much attention to the management structure of the group you were working with.
Maybe that's why. It started off called Tholian Web, which is actually on some of the PC boards, I think, still.
It's on John's.
Yeah, it says Tholian Web on the side. It was after the Star Trek episode called Tholian Web, and I wanted to do this thing where you got tied up into these things were spinning webs, and you had to shoot them to stop them and you get out. It wasn't much of a game, but I was fascinated by the idea of a maze, and I think the maze, I started drawing mazes next to see what I could do with a Pac-Man kind of like idea in vector. And Lyle Raines, I don't know if Lyle comes to these shows or not, he started drawing this character. He's actually the one who drew the first Major Havoc, and he tells me that some of it was watching what I was doing. So when I talk to him, I stand there with my arms crossed and tap my foot. He's in the game. I lean against a wall. It's so he really gave the thing character by watching me, he says. But I'd love to really hear that again. But I started just playing, running him around the maze and trying to figure out what I could do, and it just sort of grew from there. I have a very obnoxious sense of humor, and I think my idea was to just put the whole kitchen sink into this. What could I get into one game and get away with? And that's really what it is. I mean, the fight is sort of like Galaga, but on a 3D kind of feel. The running around the maze, kind of, Pac-Man. You got to pick up those oxygen dots. I mean, that wasn't accidental. I was a real fan of the original Battlestar Galactica of the time, so a lot of the graphics design comes right out of the original Battlestar.
Well, it sounds so. With all that, though, let's jump into sort of where we are now. 2017, a bunch of things sort of came together all of a sudden. We'd all talked about this. I'd done stuff in the past. Owen and I had always talked about potentially doing something Scott sort of was on the verge of getting an FPGA simulation of this hardware. Luke Dyson was getting ready to make his reproduction PCBs. Anybody buy Luke's PCBs? All right, you got them stuffed yet? Yeah, all right, that was a job. It was fun? All right. I bet they look really nice because they're good looking boards. But so luckily, his boards support this modification. There are modifications that you have to do to a stock board. And we'll talk about that later. But so we sort of all started talking about this and what would specifically Luke need to do and what would Scott need to do to give more space, because the original boards were filled, the ROMs were full, there wasn't a whole lot of space left, and so we talked about how to expand program ROM. Did we need more vector ROM or RAM? Did we need more program RAM, etc. And in the end, we ended up that really all we needed was expanded alpha ROM space. There's 4 pages of vector or of program ROM. We expanded that to 8 pages, and the gamma went from a 27128 to a 27256 because it had unused address space.
For those of you who don't understand what he's talking about, the board actually has space for 3 processors because they used this math box that Mike worked on for other things. I thought you worked on math.
Oh, no, I did. But
Yeah,
I
and they decided-
We didn't use my math box.
No, they decided they didn't want to pay the price.
There was a lot of bit slice.
So,
hardware.
yeah, I guess it was expensive, or they said no. So there were supposed to be 3 processors on here. I ended up being able to do it in 2. So that's what this hole up here is for.
Yeah, that's.
So when he says alpha and gamma, that's the first and third processor.
Yeah, and this was, ironically, because you've been developing it so long, this was really one of the first games that had multi-CPUs as far as I could figure out at the time.
Other than the math box.
This is one of the, Star Wars came out before this, I think, but it probably started development after, pretty quick, but, so they were neck and neck. But this had the slave sound processor, which became the norm at this point, and the beta processor, like Owen mentioned, is missing. That's the part in the corner with missing chips. So we got the hardware all figured out, and sort of all got on the same page with that, and said, okay, let's do it. I'll work within the constraints of that hardware. Luke and Mark got the Repro PCBs designed to support that, and Scott was on board with his FPGA stuff. So it all came together. Now we just had to work on code, lots of code. So, like I said, this is a true project in that Owen had the listings, but I still disassembled all the ROMs, went through, and I had to get it into a compilable state. So I disassembled everything, went through, took his comments and put them in there, cleaned things up.
Well, you had done that before you even saw the listings.
It was there, but it was ugly, and it didn't compile very well. So, but that took a year to get the code sort of in a compilable state, and that was prior to last year, getting that all figured out, etc. Getting a compiler built, use Notepad, get syntax highlighting, get a name driver built so we could test it, and it all sort of came together, but it was pure assembly language, macro driven, so there's fancy things like ifs, if statements and else's, begins and loops. That's about it.
Shepard and Declan Corporation.
Completely mimicked the Atari compiler at the time and used Thomas Anderson's TASM as the compiler for this and rebuilt all the macros, and it worked. Eventually I was able to compile a version of the production version 3 ROMs, and then we went from there and started developing. Went through lots of thoughts on what was next. And so that sort of gets us to what were we trying to attain? Owen's big rocks that he sort of threw at us, and the ones that I sort of threw to him even, I was like, well, we need a home world, obviously, or some sort of a concept of a home world. We need to put the Star Castle back. The Star Castle was in there early.